Queer is the most challenging film I think I've ever seen in cinemas. I cannot stop thinking about it. I cannot stop talking about it. The structure is strange and confronting and weird, and its themes are tragic and haunting and lingering. The performance from Daniel Craig is maybe the best of the year. Like low-key sleeper hit for Daniel Craig here. It is stylish. The score is beautiful. There is something hypnotic about this movie and the way it presents sexuality and longing and kind of like feeling out of place in your own body almost. And I think off the back of Challenges, which was Luca Guadagnino's most accessible film, this is a fucking right hook. You know, this movie comes out of nowhere and is really, really challenging. And I could tell in the premiere I was seeing, there were some people that were there to see the guy from Outer Banks and were just like, what on earth am I watching? There was constant chatter. And the movie gets more and more challenging as it goes on. So today I want to give a spoiler-free review, why I recommend this movie, who should watch it if they're interested, general interpretations that are spoiler-free, and then the bulk of this video is going to be spoiler-filled interpretation. So this is based on a William S. Burroughs book. It's essentially autobiographical. It's similar to Baby Reindeer and how the creator of that show, Richard Gadd, kind of created Baby Reindeer, right? And then called himself Donnie Dunn and fictionalized some events and some names, but it's really based in a reality he lived. This is similar until it gets interpretive and dreamlike. This is similar, right? So William S. Burroughs wrote this character of Lee to represent basically his own situation in life at the time, struggling with his sexuality, struggling as a queer man who had to flee to Mexico because he couldn't be, you know, gay or queer in America, right? And I think right off the bat, the big thing in this movie is there is a sense of kind of patheticness. There's a sense of tragedy in sort of longing that's kind of embarrassing. This movie feels embarrassing. When you start the movie, it initially feels really sensual and cool. They're constantly dropping these like Nirvana classics. The soundtrack is hip and awesome. It almost represents how Lee sees himself, the main character played by Daniel Craig, how he sees himself when he's like kind of feeling himself and like wanting to pursue these younger men. But then as the movie goes on, it makes you sit in these really uncomfortable moments of him basically bombing. A lot of this movie is kind of watching this guy who's a bit past his prime physically and kind of looking at the younger generation as targets for his love and affection. And this movie is very much reckoning with how groomy and coercive and pathetic all this feels. Lee is a character who, if it was from kind of the other perspective, right? If this film was from the perspective of the men he was pursuing, the younger men he was pursuing, he would feel predatory and cringy and icky and gross. And that is definitely baked into the movie. But somehow this movie walks this really fine line of basically having someone that can feel very overbearing and predatory in the wrong context, but framing him as empathetic and tragic and pathetic and embarrassing. And this isn't really me trying to like fully blast him, but I haven't seen a movie in a while where I've felt so much pity for a character just without even spelling it out. There's a lot of early sexual escapades that our main character Lee gets into with younger men that I find are very telling for the audience without holding our hands and spelling it out completely. Similar to Challenges, where tennis was kind of a metaphor for sexual dynamics, and Bones and All, where the act of eating someone completely was kind of seen as this almost sexual fulfillment. Like there's a layer of that in Bones and All. In Queer, there's this really uncomfortable sort of exploration of exchange in these dynamics. You know, Lee consistently is the one servicing these other young men in these sexual scenarios and really often not expecting anything in return. He's almost grateful just to be in the room with them, just to be a source of pleasure for other people, even if he's not desired himself by these people. I think it's so well communicated without, again, holding our hand. And there is just such a tragic nature to Lee. There's this layer of tragedy in all these early kind of sexual escapades he gets into, even with our main love interest, Eugene, who Lee becomes obsessed with. Most of this movie is dealing not with a mutual love story, in my opinion. Now, the director has said that this is a love story not about unrequited love, it's about love out of sync. You know, this idea that Lee is much older than Eugene, so they never quite get on the right terms. Eugene is at a different point in his self-discovery and his queer journey, and Lee is already kind of accepting of who he is and who he wants to be and what he wants out of a relationship and of a partner. Eugene is not sure. And that brings me to the main love story, romance, whatever you want to call it, in this movie. Now, Luca Guadagnino has said that the story between Lee and his much younger love interest, Eugene, is one not of unrequited love, like kind of Call Me By Your Name by the end of it, but rather one about love out of sync. And I agree, like technically this is the director saying what the movie is about, so who am I to disagree? But I think it's slightly more complicated than that. I think, yes, technically, like they are out of sync, right? Lee is much further along in his journey of accepting himself as a queer man and happy to go down that route. And Eugene is not as much. But I think this is also something that Lee tells himself. I think it's really important to note that consistently throughout the movie, Lee is trying to figure out whether Eugene is queer. And if Eugene is queer, then he must be into Lee. The feeling will be mutual. All he needs to know is that Eugene is queer. And I think that's missing a really important part, which is just because they're queer doesn't mean they're into you. You know, and Lee's advances are endless and suffocating and pathetic. And again, bordering on groomy. He will offer money in exchange for attention and time. He won't leave them alone. There's this really great early scene where he's talking to a bunch of young men who say, you know, the issue with hanging out with these older gay men is at some point they'll always want to fuck you. They're always going to try seduce you, and it's repressive. I don't think he has an idea of what actual male friendships are. And initially when we hear this, because we've only seen Lee being sweet and quiet and kind of endearing, you hear that and it feels like a really harsh characterization of Lee. But as the movie goes on, even though you have this built-in empathy and pity for him, you can't help but see that kind of realized. And there's this frustration and tension between Eugene and Lee, where Eugene is like, yes, okay, occasionally I'll do sexual stuff with you and I'll be your companion on your little escapades sometimes, but it's too much. You want too much from me too quickly, and you're trying to put me in a box and define me so I can be yours, not out of genuine concern. But before I get into full spoilers, I think similar to what The Substance did with kind of women and aging, I think this movie actually does really, really well and effectively, but with men, and maybe men specifically in the gay community. But I was really finding this a tough watch in the way it kind of explored Daniel Craig / Lee's sense of starting to feel too old for the people he wants to be with romantically or sexually. I think, again, the thing I appreciate about this movie is it doesn't spell it out too much, but there are all these scenes where he'll kind of look at the young people he's trying to seduce, and they'll be framed as beautiful and picturesque. Again, Luca Guadagnino knows how to frame like seduction and longing. So you have all these beautiful shots of like the young male form, and then it will smash cut, hard cut to Daniel Craig's kind of drug bloated appearance, bloodshot eyes, kind of like struggling to even string together a sentence and keep a consistent gaze, you know? And this is no diss on Daniel Craig. I think he's an incredibly attractive guy and he's aged very well, but the way the film frames him is just constantly kind of, his body is giving in, and he's tired and drugged out and constantly on a bender compared to these young, beautiful people that can handle that a bit better. There's this great scene where he goes to a party with a bunch of young people and looks in the mirror. And again, nothing is super clearly communicated. You're meant to pick up on all this, but he's like doing his hair and looking at himself in the mirror. And you can tell, you know exactly what he's thinking. You know, what am I doing here? I'm such a dickhead. Like, these guys don't like me. So he has to drink and do drugs to convince himself that he's worthy of this affection. And again, I love that, yeah, all these scenes he has with these young men sexually, he is the one giving, not expecting anything in return. And Eugene is the first person to offer something in return. And that kind of gets their relationship, their pursuit going. But to me, even that didn't feel super mutual. You know, Lee had plowed in with drinks, being like, drink, drink, drink. And again, it's not exactly like something he should be sent to jail for, or we completely morally write off the character, but he had been being like, have a drink, trying to loosen him up. Eugene then vomits, and then, you know, after Lee offers to clean him up, then they have a bit of a sexual escapade. You know, Lee gives something to him, and then surprisingly, Eugene offers something back, but it's not the exact same mutual thing. If you've seen the movie, you know, but it's hand for mouth, right? And Lee just seems so grateful for this attention at all. And I just think the movie sums this up perfectly. So to get into anything more, I do need to get into full spoilers of theories, where this movie goes, the wild turn this movie takes. But if any of this sounds interesting to you, this like portrait of a tragic, slightly creepy, predatory, but embarrassing, and someone you care for, queer character, I really think this movie is worth a watch. And that's just the first hour and 10 minutes. Then this movie shifts into something else completely. So I love that first hour, 10 minutes, 5 out of 5. This would have been easily the best movie I've seen. We're only a month into 2025, but easily would have been front runner for favorite of the year. It's where this movie goes after that initial introduction in Mexico, where the movie gets really challenging. I think is going to push a lot of people. So if you don't care about spoilers, I'm going to get into it fully. We've covered part 1 of the movie. We're now going to get into part 2 and part 3, theories, spoilers. Let's go. Leave now. See the movie if it interests you. Now it's time for spoilers. All right, guys, quick break, quick note. I am currently offering YouTube memberships for this channel. What you're getting with a purchase of a YouTube membership is access to a monthly or fortnightly podcast I do, where I cover everything I've watched in a given month. On top of that, I'm currently getting through my year-end roundups, where I'm going through every single movie I watched, ranking them, best and worst. I am also working on all the shows I watched last year. So anything you want me to talk about is probably going to be talked about in the membership only part. On top of that, I take votes on members only videos to cover. So members get to vote on a specific movie or mini series I will do a members only video on. It's all for like the cost of a cup of coffee a month, and it really helps out the channel. Thank you so much for considering. And back to the video. So part 2, right? Launches off the end of part 1, where Lee basically begs Eugene to come with him to a trip to Mexico. All right. And previously we've seen all these beautiful shots of longing. I probably should have mentioned this in the spoiler-free section, but these moments where Daniel Craig's Lee imagines touching Eugene, imagines talking to Eugene, touching him, holding him, and you see like a kind of spiritual visual representation of what his longing looks like. So he's imagining touching Eugene, and then you'll kind of see that, you know, it's beautiful. And the reason I bring this up is because there's this one moment where he's imagining reaching his hand over onto his shoulder or around his body, and Eugene actually kind of glances over, even though he technically hasn't done that in real life. And I'm like, oh, is this movie going in a not supernatural direction, but like a spiritual direction? Like they have a bond that even though they can't talk about physically or show externally, like it's there. And I did notice him kind of glancing over his shoulder. Keep an eye out if you haven't seen the movie or do a rewatch. These moments where, yeah, he's having this like almost spiritual connection with Eugene, and you start hearing talks from Lee about these drugs he wants to take to seemingly connect with Eugene, right? He doesn't tell Eugene about this explicitly. It seems like, whether you want to call it grooming or manipulation or just desperate attempts at love, Lee throughout the movie has been being like, come to my place, have drinks, go on holiday with me, I'll pay you, I'll buy you drinks, I'll buy you alcohol, I'll buy you drugs, you can ignore me the whole time, like please just spend time with me. And you can tell Eugene is struggling with this. Sometimes he's really aggressively pushing Lee away, and he's confronted by this guy that feels predatory. Other times he takes pity on him and will kind of do some sexual things with him or do some romantic things with him, but it always feels like it's coming from a place of pity with some inbuilt resentment or just like confusion. It almost reminds me of when you have to go on things with like a family member you don't like who really pisses you off, and they kind of drive you nuts, but you feel bad for them and you're like, oh, okay, fine. It feels like that, but romantically. There are moments where it seems like maybe Eugene is kind of warming up to Lee a bit, but you're almost like, is that kind of like, not Stockholm syndrome, but like a bit, right? Like, to me, it didn't feel like they were mutually in love. It felt like Eugene was tolerating Lee's advances, occasionally saw some potential, but was then like, I'm not going to be with this old, creepy, queer guy seriously. Like, I'll tolerate him for now, and then I'll go for someone much younger. Regardless, the reason I say all this is because, yeah, Lee gets obsessed with this idea of finding these psychedelic drugs so he can do telepathy, obviously with Eugene, all right? He doesn't say this out loud, but he keeps being like, ooh, if I could do telepathy, that would be great. And people are like, why are you so obsessed with telepathy? And he never says this out loud. And to me, my interpretation was this feels like the ultimate end goal of his desperate attempts to manipulate or get Eugene to realize his true feelings or fall in love with him, depending on how you view Lee and his advances, right? You either see it as the ultimate manipulation attempt, right? Drug him in this psychedelic way so he can telepathically manipulate him, or you see it as this like, oh, if only he can realize who he truly is and truly realize his love for me, this is the way to do it. Either one comes off a bit predatory and weird, right? But regardless, Lee is hellbent on doing this. And this is where the movie gets really, really complicated. So you have these amazing sections while they're on holiday where Lee is struggling from drug withdrawals. And I think the portrayal here is excellent. Now, I forgot to mention earlier, the moment where I thought this movie could have ended, in my opinion, is when he'd had a few flings with Eugene before he left New Mexico, before they agreed to go on the trip. And he goes to that party and embarrasses himself. He falls over. Eugene looks repulsed and embarrassed by association, right? And Lee goes up to his apartment and shoots up with drugs. And we just sit in that moment with him. You know, it's like he's letting go of trying to be young again, trying to pursue this guy, shoots up on drugs. And I genuinely thought the movie could have ended there. I thought it was this great portrait of loneliness, specifically queer loneliness, and a guy stooping to a really gross level, trying to kind of manipulate and coerce someone into loving him, and then going to this party, embarrassing himself, realizing what he's doing, realizing what he's become, and then kind of self-deleting with drugs at the end. And I thought it was flawless. I had no notes. I was like, if the movie ended there, perfect. Like, straight up masterpiece. Sad, tragic, 80-minute movie, perfect. But the movie kept going. But just to clarify, that was where I was at before. So in this new section, they go to New Mexico. Now Lee is struggling from drug withdrawals. And this section kind of solidifies what I was saying before about it feels like Eugene does care about him, but I wouldn't say loves him. I think he takes pity on him. And in this section, it's like, oh my God, this is more than I signed up for. You know, you told me I could come on this trip, I'd get paid to do it, I'd get to sleep with women, have drugs, just have to entertain you twice a week, and now I'm having to take care of you. And if I don't take care of you, I look like an asshole because I'm leaving someone struggling with withdrawals alone. So you do get these moments of tenderness and care, but these moments of tenderness and care are kind of not love-based. It's sort of just like basic human empathy. Like this guy that's paying for me to be on a holiday is struggling and borderline dying, so I better like soothe him a bit. One of the greatest moments of the movie, which comes back towards the end, is Lee starts getting shivers, like getting cold from his withdrawals, and begs to get into bed with Eugene, and Eugene doesn't even hold him. Eugene just lies and goes, fine, get into bed with me, and Lee holds him. And for Lee, this is like, oh my God, like I'm finally close to him. He really cares about me. What a beautiful moment. And for Eugene, you get this sense of like, oh my God, for fuck's sake. So good. So good. I think the character dynamics that were set up here, in my opinion, were just so effective because for one guy, this is everything he's wanted. And for the other guy, it's this like, oh my God, okay, fine, whatever. And I think this being the moment that the movie gets back to towards the end and being part of the posters and the promotion is just so tragic. So then we get into kind of the third section, and it's the only section I have issues with. And the issues I have with the third section are not the weird, trippy, David Lynch-like visuals when they actually try the drugs. That's awesome. And this might be a hot take. The only part I'm struggling with in this movie is I think the movie should have been exactly how it was for part 1, exactly how it was for part 2, and in part 3, you just kind of skip the whole section of them learning about the drugs, learning about the people that make the drugs, having to go through all these tests. It just went on too long. And I think this movie was really working as a bottle character movie, right? Similar to The Lighthouse, where The Lighthouse was focused purely on Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, and it never broke that. I think this movie was clearly just about Lee and Eugene, really hyper focused on that, almost to this dreamlike sense that Mexico had, where it felt like they were almost in limbo and the only two people there, minus these few faces that pop up, like Lee's best friend and Eugene's kind of redheaded love interest, who feels like almost like just a figment of like what women represent to Lee, right? He also has a dream about a redheaded woman, which we will get into when I'm done talking about the movie as a whole. But yeah, this third section, I just think I like where the drugs get us to. And I think you need it. And I think you need the payoff for this ultimate kind of manipulation and challenge that Lee presents to Eugene. But I just feel like that section with the actual person that made the drugs went on way too long for stuff that I would have, honestly, I wish the time was allocated more to Lee and Eugene. I loved seeing Lee kind of be a bit more lively and happy-go-lucky, but I also think that felt like a bit of a betrayal to what was set up. I liked Lee being really pathetic, and it was this point where it was like it wasn't working for me as much because I didn't really know how Eugene felt about the drugs, and I almost would have preferred if Eugene taking the drugs was a manipulation. I think the movie might have worked slightly better, and I'll explain why. I think if Lee had gone off screen and just picked up the drugs while they're on holiday, you know, maybe you have a 5-minute scene where he's getting the drugs, fine. Like, I'll humor that. Eugene doesn't know what they're doing. He comes back and spikes Eugene's tea, but then they have this beautiful, transcendent, drug-fueled connection that, like, no one else on the planet's ever had, or like people normally can't have it. And then we would be seen there left as an audience being like, what do we make of that, right? He like spiked his drink with drugs and clearly manipulated him, right? You'd like lean into that slightly darker nature we've seen of Lee. But how do we reckon with that when there was this beautiful thing that came from that, this beautiful connection that, you know, they couldn't even talk about in a physical level? You know, there's that early on quote where Lee says to Eugene, like, I want to talk to you without speaking. And this feels like the ultimate payoff for that, but it came through fucked up means. But instead they kind of do it mutually, and I just didn't really get how Eugene particularly felt about it. It felt slightly disconnected from what was a really tight movie up until that point, and not in the good interpretive way. But aside from that section and thinking that the stuff with the drug creator went on way too long, I didn't need to know all that, in my opinion. And it actually felt like the movie went from a queer love story to kind of really interested in how drugs work. And I'm like, why? Especially when this movie gets so metaphorical and kind of like feeling based. I didn't need to know the science and the intentions. Like, I don't really care. I don't know if that sounds ignorant, but especially when the rest of the movie is so interpretive when they actually take the drugs. Anyways. So the section where they take the drugs wouldn't change a thing about it. It's incredible. It starts with this insane visual of them vomiting up their hearts, like essentially spilling their guts to each other. And then you have this section. I don't know how they did the effects, by the way. Like, absolutely groundbreaking visual effects. But they start literally morphing into each other. This never looks bad. This never looks shitty. Like, the effects here are incredible. And a genuine marvel watching Daniel Craig's Lee and Eugene like literally wear each other as like skin suits. Like even me explaining it does not do it justice. And I think this is Luca Guadagnino in his fucking element, right? Like, he has been the master of shooting sensuality and desire and longing. Even in Challenges, it was like just oppressive in how sexually aggressive that movie was. Bones and all had that feeling too. And here, it feels like this ultimate payoff of how being obsessed with someone and wanting to like be part of someone's life feels. It's perfect and awesome. And the drug dealer says to Eugene, like, you know, this is like an insane experience you've had on your first go, and you can never close that door. And what it felt like to me, what I took from this section was that Lee is pursuing Eugene and Eugene is not necessarily pursuing Lee. Eugene is not sure of whether he's straight, gay, bisexual, whatever. And if he is, he doesn't want Lee to be the one that decides that for him. He wants to get there on his own, and he doesn't want to feel like he's kind of being coerced or convinced by Lee. All right? That's what it felt like to me. And I think Lee, even though it's not acknowledged out loud, succeeds in that a bit. I think he does like kind of present something that's rather confronting to Eugene, because Eugene afterwards is like, I'm not queer, I'm disembodied, and he's freaked out. And it's interesting because that's actually something that Lee said in a dream earlier in the movie. Now Eugene is saying, so that proves that they had this like insane connection that like transcends what most people can have, right? Because now they're quoting each other. And I like that Lee doesn't kind of bring this up. You know, he doesn't go, oh, that came to me in a dream. Like, we just have to infer that. Great stuff. But I think, yeah, like to me, it felt like Eugene did actually have a realization there, was confronted by the connection they felt and didn't know what to do with that. It's like, oh my God, I had this connection with this guy that I've been pushing off and giving the brush off for the entire movie. What does that mean? What is that? Like, I can't even handle it. And he needs to get the fuck out of there. And that is the last we see of Eugene. So to me, it felt like, yeah, he had this awakening. Lee did it. And whether you think that's manipulative and awful or beautiful, Lee did it. And Eugene is freaked the fuck out. And we don't see him for the rest of the movie. That's it. Tragic. Lee doesn't get to talk to him again. He's out. We have this insane visual. Even though we've had some insane visuals, they were like very realistic feeling insane visuals. Then you have what feels like it's out of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the character floats off into space. Lee just like crash lands back into Mexico. I think the point of that is that he basically stayed there for 2 years doing these insane drugs, which I would have loved to see. Like, I would have loved if Eugene abandoned him and Lee kept taking these drugs, hoping to kind of telepathically communicate with him. But regardless, hard cuts 2 years later, Lee crash lands back in Mexico, and we get this incredible epilogue. So part 4 is just transcendent. And I would have loved if, yeah, we just skipped all the drug making stuff, skipped right to the drugs basically, had everything the same. Maybe Lee is the one to spike him. You get this beautiful moment of confrontation. Eugene runs away from it. We don't see Eugene again. Everything else is perfect. So Lee gets back and is told by his kind of best friend that Eugene has actually gone back to, I think, South America to explore with another man. So assumingly he's now taking young men or people around his age to have these drug experiences, maybe chasing the high, the connection he had with Lee, but with someone more age appropriate, someone he feels mutual love with. So it's almost like he's learned this sort of behavior from Lee, and he's now repeating it, just not with Lee. And that hurts Lee. Like, you see Lee starts tearing up when he hears this. Like, oh, I just got back and this guy's living this full life without me, you know? And there's this sense of tragedy to that. Like, he seems genuinely really hurt and confused, and it holds, and you think you're going to get this call me by your name ending where he's just crying and reflecting on what we saw. And again, that would have been great. All right. Like, I love the tragic payoffs that we get for Lee's character. It feels like he's simultaneously getting punished, but also the movie wants us to have empathy for him. I also think it's important to note that his friend feels like he's into Lee. You know, Lee feels obviously very into Eugene, and for Eugene, it didn't feel very mutual. Again, maybe according to Luca, they're out of sync, which I will get to when I start talking about theories, but I find it important to note also that Lee's best friend clearly feels like he's into Lee at that point. He starts talking about how he missed him and how it's so good to have him back. And there are these lingering shots that Lee doesn't even notice because Lee's thinking about Eugene. Then we get the ending. And this movie gets fucking weird in the ending. So Lee goes up to his room, goes to sleep, and has these insane dreams where he's looking into the hotel room that basically most of the movie has been set in. Like, literally looking into it. Like, giant Daniel Craig literally peeping like through a window. So his eyeball's this massive. And he's watching himself interact with Eugene. He plays William Tell, the game where you shoot shot glasses off, and shoots Eugene, which we will get to, is important. This is a reference. Okay, fine, we'll get to it now. This is a reference to William S. Burroughs in real life. The character that Lee is based on accidentally shot his wife playing this game. But the thing is, without that, right, without that interpretation, without that extra knowledge, he shoots Eugene and then kind of dies himself. And at this point, I genuinely thought the movie was suggesting that maybe this whole thing's been set in this limbo, a representation of what it's like to be queer and struggling with accepting that, and that Eugene is meant to represent a younger Lee. That was genuinely an interpretation I got. And at points, they look really similar, especially in this moment. They both have a similar tear come. Eugene, I think, has a tear run from his eye, and then it cuts to Lee sleeping, who also has a tear coming from his eye. And I felt like a madman, but the more I thought about the movie, the more I was like, is it maybe suggesting that this whole thing has been an older Lee looking at a younger Lee, and they're destined to repeat this cycle? Lee struggled with his sexuality when he was younger, which he tells Eugene about. He talks about the fact that he was running away from him for ages, and now he feels like he's trying to make up for lost time. And it feels like Eugene is inevitably going to do that too. Eugene has a young, red-headed girl he's interested in. Lee had a red-headed woman that he shot. Are they both the same person endlessly on this cycle, or is this just a really strange dream Lee is having, looking back on his favorite moments with Eugene? Either one works, and we'll flesh that out more. But regardless, on top of that, to further my theory, there's this shot of a snake eating itself in the infinity symbol. So yeah, I don't think it's a dumb interpretation to think that maybe this whole thing is they're kind of in this purgatory state in Mexico, and Daniel Craig's Lee is the older version of Eugene, and they're destined to be on this sort of self-destructive cycle. It did kind of feel like that, but I guess at the same time, Lee is in whatever. All right, there were points where I was genuinely wondering if that's what the movie was getting at. But regardless, I think even dropping that theory, and again, there's a lot of stuff there to support it. I think even if you just look at it as Lee got back to Mexico, Eugene has completely moved on with his life, learn a bunch of things from Lee about his sexuality and what he wants in a partner, but abandons Lee. And now Lee goes up to his room every night, high off his head, right? Off his rocker on drugs, cries himself to sleep, and then has these vivid dreams of how they're always going to be connected and they always had this bond, only to then think back to that moment where he was cradling Eugene when he was the one almost shivering to death, and look back at that as the most romantic moment he's had in his life. This old guy that was seen as a creep and couldn't get anyone who he looked to and was attracted to physically to look at him back and love him. He now thinks of that as his most romantic moment. Every night he goes to bed and thinks about that. And then we see an older version of Lee still doing that, dreaming that Eugene is, maybe going to hug him. It's beautiful. And it's so, so sad. And to me, even if you just see it as a dream that Lee's character is having recurring, he's going to dream about this for the rest of his life, I felt like what it was communicating visually was yeah, that's it for him. He's going to go to bed every night and think of Eugene, who's going to stay the same age in his brain as where he left him, right, in his memory. And Lee is going to age and just think about being held by him or holding him when he was cold until he dies. And then finally he can maybe be in this spiritual plane, because then we have this cut into his eyes where the lights start flickering, and maybe one represents Lee and one represents Eugene. Is just such a devastatingly sad ending, and kind of brings the movie back around. I was really happy with the movie ending in that initial scene where he went up and did drugs after feeling like, oh, I'm just this old pathetic loser, what am I doing? And this feels like this really transcendent way to get back to that point. Lee just has these really just tragic dreams about being with Eugene, and truthfully it feels like Eugene will never think about him again, or barely. Right? Eugene's going to run off with people his own age, more age appropriate, and be with them. And yeah, Lee just thinks back to a moment that as an audience we can see was kind of pathetic and almost cruel from Eugene. But Lee sees it as beautiful and the most kind of romantically involved he's been. And it's just so good. It's just so good. And truthfully, if that third section was slightly tighter and we cut out more of that drug stuff, this would have been like easily like a flawless movie for me. And the more I've thought about the interpretive ending and these drug sequences and this insane dream sequence at the end, the better the movie's got. But yeah, there is stuff alluding to William S. Burroughs' real life, but truthfully, I kind of like the interpretations I took away from this movie. I know William S. Burroughs, accidentally shot his wife playing William Tell, and so you can see that maybe him shooting Lee in the dream is kind of like this idea, this cycle he's in of hurting romantic partners he's into, and he's always on this inevitable cycle. But I don't know, like first off, I did get vibes that maybe they were the same person. And New Mexico represented this like limbo place where they're constantly wanting to be who they want to be, but not able to do that. And they're always going to be on this cycle. But even if it's not that, I think just this idea that it's a straightforward romance that, maybe if they were the same age and Eugene came back at Lee's age and Lee was still the same age, they could be together. But I think, the ending does kind of solidify what Luca Guadagnino was saying about this being a love story that's out of sync. This idea that, old man Lee is going to die thinking about young Eugene and what could have been and what never was. And I think the way this movie takes what could have been a really creepy archetype and relationship and really humanizes something that often is hard to humanize. Creepy fucking, guys that are kind of pathetic and desperate and manipulative in their attempts at love. Humanizing that out is a hard balance to find. And I was effectively kind of uncomfortable and moved and stirred. I just thought this movie was... I can't stop thinking about it, for sure. But I loved it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my analysis and interpretation of Queer. I hope it didn't go on too long or I wasn't too cooked this whole video. But thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and have a lovely day.